Some doors stay locked because of what they hide. Others stay locked because someone is praying the right soul will refuse to walk away. At 2:07 in the morning, beneath the cold white lights of a military logistics warehouse near the North Carolina coast, a German shepherd named Ranger lay across the concrete in front of a moving truck and would not move. Rain struck the corrugated steel roof in hard, steady waves, and the wind pushed the smell of salt, diesel, and wet pine through the half-open loading bay. Forklift engines hummed in the dark. Chains shifted. Tires hissed over damp pavement. Everything in the warehouse had a place, a label, and a destination. Everything except Ranger. The 6-year-old K9 pressed his chest flat against the floor, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on a large gray shipping crate suspended 3 feet above the ground. Stenciled across its side in faded black paint was a number Ethan Walker had already seen twice that night. 117. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker tightened his grip on the leash, though he knew the gesture meant nothing. Ranger was not pulling. He was not panicking. He was choosing. Ethan had seen the dog refuse food, refuse rest, even refuse shelter during storms, but never like this. Ranger's body formed a quiet barrier between the truck and the crate, as if every inch of him had been placed there for one purpose. Ethan leaned down, his field jacket darkened by the rain blowing through the bay. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. "Move with me." Ranger did not look back. His front paws remained planted on the concrete. One nail had scraped against the floor from holding his ground, but the dog seemed unaware of it. His breathing was slow, controlled, listening. Behind Ethan, the forklift operator cut the engine. The sudden silence made the rain sound louder. Somewhere above them, a loose strip of metal tapped against the roof with a thin, nervous rhythm. Major Owen Barrett stepped out from beside the truck, his uniform pressed sharp even at that hour, his gray raincoat buttoned to the throat. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver at his temples and the calm expression of someone used to being obeyed before he finished speaking. He looked first at Ethan, then at Ranger, then at the crate. "Move the dog, Sergeant." His voice was quiet. That made it heavier. Ethan straightened, but kept one hand low near Ranger's collar. "He alerted on the crate, sir. He has alerted 3 times tonight. Not like this." Barrett's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "The cargo has been cleared. Medical equipment. Decommissioned. Nothing inside worth delaying transport." Ranger's ears twitched at the word inside. Ethan noticed. So did Barrett. For 1 second, neither man spoke. The forklift operator stared at the floor. A young Marine near the loading door shifted his weight, but said nothing. The warehouse seemed to draw inward around the crate, every pale beam of light pointing toward it. Ethan crouched again. Ranger's coat was damp along the spine, nearly black under the fluorescent lamps. The dog did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched the steel box hanging above him as though waiting for it to breathe. Ethan followed his gaze. The crate was 8 feet long and 4 feet high, sealed with a heavy steel lock. Its corners were reinforced. A strip of fresh paint covered one side, too fresh for cargo marked as surplus. The shipping tag fluttered in the draft. Charleston to Norfolk. Transfer approved. Priority clearance. Yet something about the paperwork had bothered Ethan from the moment he saw it. The ink was new. The crate was old. The destination stamp had been applied twice. Small things. Forgettable things. Ranger had forgotten none of them. "Sergeant Walker," Barrett said, more firmly now, "this shipment leaves in 5 minutes." Ethan looked up. "Who ordered the overnight transfer?" "That is above your clearance." "Then why was my K9 assigned to inspect it?" Barrett's jaw tightened. "Because procedure requires a sweep. The sweep is complete." Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Every muscle in his body became still. Not tense. Still. His nose tilted toward the lower seam of the crate. Ethan felt the leash slacken. Ranger rose halfway, took one measured step forward, and pressed his ear against the metal. The sound of the rain filled the bay. The forklift ticked as its engine cooled. Barrett glanced toward the truck. "Enough." He motioned to 2 Marines near the loading door. "Remove the dog." They took 1 step. Ranger lowered himself again, this time directly beneath the crate's path. Ethan raised a hand. "Don't." The word came out before rank, protocol, or consequence could stop it. Barrett stared at him. "Excuse me." Ethan did not answer. His eyes were on Ranger. The dog had shifted his gaze from the crate to Ethan's face. There was no fear in it, no confusion, only the same steady look Ethan had seen in desert heat, in smoke, in the long hours before dawn when a good dog knew danger was near but could not explain it in words. Ranger was asking for trust, not comfort, not permission, trust. Then, from somewhere inside the locked crate, came 3 faint knocks, soft enough to be mistaken for settling metal, close enough together to have a rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Every person in the loading bay froze. Ethan's hand slowly fell from the leash. Barrett's face lost its color beneath the fluorescent light. Ranger did not move. He had already heard the answer. The rest of them were only beginning to understand the question. 18 hours earlier, morning light had come slowly over the North Carolina coast, pale and silver behind a curtain of low clouds. The air at Camp Lejeune carried the clean bite of salt water, damp earth, and pine needles pressed flat by an overnight rain. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker crossed the service yard with Ranger moving at his left side, their pace steady, their shadows faint beneath the gray sky. Ethan was 38, broad-shouldered, fair-skinned, and built with the quiet strength of a man who had spent most of his adult life carrying weight without complaint. His brown hair was cut close, his jaw rough with the first hint of morning stubble, and his blue-gray eyes held the tired patience of someone who had learned how to function while part of him remained somewhere else. Ranger matched him step for step. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, sable-coated, lean, and watchful, with a dark saddle along his back and a small scar near the edge of his left ear. He had once moved with another Marine. He had once slept outside another door. He had once answered to another voice. That voice had belonged to Sergeant Noah Bennett. 8 months had passed since the warehouse fire that took Noah from the unit, though Ethan had never been able to make peace with the word took. The official report said the fire began in an electrical room near a storage wing and spread before the night crew could contain it. By sunrise, part of the building had collapsed. Search teams found a burned identification tag, a damaged radio, and enough evidence for command to declare Noah dead. They never recovered a body. The absence of one should have left room for hope, but over time, hope had become another kind of pain. Ethan had attended the memorial in dress blues beneath a clear autumn sky. He had stood in front of Noah's mother, held her trembling hands, and promised that her son had not been alone. It was the only lie he had ever told her. The truth was that no one knew. Ranger had survived because he had been outside the building during the first alarm. When the flames rose behind the windows, the dog had fought his leash, pulling toward the smoke until his paws slid across the wet pavement. For 3 days afterward, he refused food. For nearly 2 weeks, he slept beside the door of the temporary command office, lifting his head at every set of footsteps. He stopped barking during duty. He still followed commands. He still found hidden objects, tracked scents, and completed every drill placed before him. But the sound that had once carried across training fields was gone, as if some part of his voice had remained in that burned building with Noah. Ethan became Ranger's new handler because there was no one else the dog trusted. The arrangement had begun as temporary. It never ended. Noah had asked Ethan once, years earlier, during a long night overseas, what would happen to Ranger if he did not come home. Ethan had laughed then and told him not to talk like that. Noah had not laughed back. He had reached down, resting one hand on the dog's neck, and said, "Do not let him think he was abandoned." Ethan had carried those words ever since. He carried something else, too. Beneath his uniform, against his chest, hung Noah's damaged identification tag. The metal was darkened by heat, one edge warped, the stamped letters still visible if the light struck them correctly. Ethan had been given the tag after the investigation closed. He wore it beside his own, though he told no one. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, Ranger would press his nose to Ethan's shirt exactly where the metal rested. On those mornings, Ethan wondered whether the dog remembered the scent of Noah's hands, or only the grief Ethan could no longer hide. Ranger slowed as they approached the canine training yard. A group of younger Marines were preparing for a search exercise, setting sealed containers along a line of concrete barriers. One of them called a greeting. Ethan answered with a nod. Ranger's attention remained on the road beyond the fence. A dark transport truck rolled past at a controlled speed, followed by a second vehicle carrying a long gray crate secured beneath a canvas cover. Nothing about the convoy appeared unusual. Military bases were built on the movement of equipment, supplies, and people. Still, Ranger stopped. His ears rose. His body turned toward the road. Ethan felt the leash become gently taut. "Leave it," he said. Ranger obeyed, but his eyes followed the truck until it disappeared behind the logistics building. Ethan watched him for another second. "You know something I do not." The dog looked up at him, silent as ever. Ethan rubbed the fur behind Ranger's ear and continued toward the yard. The morning drill passed without incident. Ranger found every training scent, ignored every distraction, and returned to Ethan's side with his usual precision. Yet between exercises, his gaze drifted toward the eastern warehouses. Near noon, an operations clerk approached Ethan with a reassignment notice. A special overnight shipment required a canine security sweep before departure. The inspection would begin at Warehouse 4 after sunset. Ethan read the document once, then again. At the bottom, beneath the approval stamp, was the signature of Major Owen Barrett. Ranger stood beside him, still and attentive. Ethan folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. As he did, Noah's damaged identification tag shifted beneath his shirt and touched his skin with a sudden chill. Far across the base, beyond rows of wet pines and concrete buildings, a truck door closed with a hollow metallic sound. Ranger turned toward it immediately. By the time evening settled over the base, the rain had returned in a fine, steady mist that softened the edges of the floodlights and turned the service roads black with reflected light. Warehouse 4 stood near the eastern perimeter, a low concrete structure with corrugated steel doors and narrow windows set high along the walls. The building smelled of dust, machine oil, damp wood, and cold metal. Inside, rows of cargo containers formed long gray corridors beneath fluorescent lamps that buzzed faintly overhead. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker signed the inspection log at 7:23 and led Ranger through the main aisle. The German Shepherd moved close to his left leg, alert but calm, his nails clicking softly against the concrete. A civilian loading crew waited near the far bay while 2 Marines checked seals and identification numbers against a printed manifest. Major Owen Barrett stood beside a folding table, speaking quietly with a logistics clerk. He looked up when Ethan entered and gave a brief nod. "Routine sweep," Barrett said. "Nothing complicated." Ethan glanced toward the line of cargo. "What is the destination?" "Norfolk." "What is inside?" "Decommissioned medical equipment." The answer came too quickly. Ethan did not challenge it. He unclipped Ranger's working lead and gave the search command. Ranger began at the first container, nose moving along seams, hinges, and ventilation slots. He worked with the patience of a creature that trusted the world to reveal itself 1 cent at a time. At each crate, he paused, evaluated, and moved on. Wooden cases, sealed drums, pallets wrapped in cloudy plastic. Nothing drew more than a passing breath. Ethan followed 6 feet behind, watching every change in the dog's posture. Ranger's tail stayed level. His ears moved with the sounds around him. Forklift wheels rolled across the floor. Rain tapped against the roof. Somewhere near the loading bay, a chain struck metal with a hollow ring. Then Ranger stopped. The movement was so sudden that Ethan nearly stepped into him. They were halfway down the 3rd aisle, standing before a long steel shipping crate painted a dull military gray. It rested on a reinforced pallet several inches above the floor. A canvas cover had been folded back, exposing fresh stenciling along the side. The number read 117. Ethan felt something tighten beneath his ribs. Ranger stood motionless, his nose pointed toward the lower corner of the crate. "Search," Ethan said softly. The dog moved closer. He sniffed the lock, the hinges, and the narrow seam running along the bottom. He did not sit in the train signal for explosives. He did not scratch or bark. Instead, he pressed one side of his face against the cold metal and held it there. Ethan looked down at him. "What is it?" Ranger's right ear tilted forward. The left remained flat against the crate. He was listening. Ethan crouched and placed his palm against the steel. It was colder than the surrounding air, but he felt no vibration. No motor. No movement. Only the faint hum of the lights above them. He checked the shipping label. The crate had been logged that afternoon, but the paper was dry despite the rain outside. The origin stamp showed Charleston. The destination read Norfolk. The approval mark was clear. Too clear. Ethan leaned closer and saw a second impression beneath the first stamp, as though someone had pressed over an older destination. Ranger shifted and moved his nose toward Ethan's chest. He sniffed once at the fabric over the identification tags, then turned back to the crate. A chill passed over Ethan's skin. Number 117 had once belonged to Noah Bennett's field radio. It was not a secret code. It was not rare. Numbers repeated across units and shipments every day. Still, Ethan remembered Noah answering calls with that number in a voice that always sounded calmer than the situation deserved. 117, copy. The memory arrived with such clarity that Ethan could almost hear it in the warehouse. He stood and forced himself to breathe evenly. Coincidence had a way of wearing familiar faces when grief was near. Come, he told Ranger. The dog did not move. Ethan gave the command again, firmer this time. Ranger turned his head and looked at him. His amber eyes were steady, not confused, not frightened. Then he returned his ear to the metal. Major Barrett approached from the end of the aisle, his shoes making measured sounds against the floor. Problem, he asked. Ethan kept his attention on Ranger. He is interested in this crate. Barrett glanced at the number and then at the dog. Residual odor. Old medical shipments carry all kinds of scents. He is not giving a trained alert. Then there is no alert. Ethan looked at the reinforced lock. I want it opened. Barrett's expression did not change, but something in his posture became still. That container has already been cleared. By whom? By personnel with the proper authorization. Ranger lowered himself to the floor beside the crate, placing both front paws beneath the lower seam. Barrett watched him for a moment longer than necessary. Finish the sweep, Sergeant. Ethan reached for the lead. Ranger resisted without pulling, simply becoming heavy against the concrete. Then, from somewhere beyond the far wall, a loading door slammed shut. Every head turned toward the sound except Ranger's. He remained pressed to the steel, listening to something no one else could yet hear. The loading door's echo faded, but the tension remained. Ethan kept one hand near Ranger's collar, while Major Owen Barrett stood beside the crate with the kind of patience that felt rehearsed. Around them, the warehouse resumed its careful rhythm. A forklift backed away. A clerk turned a page. Rain whispered across the roof. Yet the space around crate 117 seemed untouched by any of it, as if the steel box carried its own silence. Finish the sweep, Barrett said again. Ethan looked at the manifest clipped to the side of the crate. I need to verify the paperwork first. Barrett's gaze settled on him. The paperwork has already been verified. Then it should not take long. Ethan lifted the metal clip and removed the form. The top page listed surplus diagnostic equipment, sealed monitors, portable pumps, and discarded field clinic supplies. The declared weight was 1,840 pounds. Ethan glanced at the crate. The pallet markings beneath it showed a recent scale reading of 2,112, a difference of nearly 300 pounds. He read the figure twice. This weight does not match. Barrett stepped closer. Old equipment is often mislabeled. By almost 300 pounds. Packaging. Reinforcement. Moisture. Ethan ran his thumb along the paper. The ink on the authorization line looked darker than the rest, as though the signature had been added later. The document named a civilian contractor Ethan did not recognize, but the military release stamp carried Barrett's office code. Ranger rose and moved along the side of the crate, nose following the lower seam. He stopped near a square patch of fresh gray paint, no larger than a dinner plate. Ethan crouched beside it. Beneath the paint, the faint outline of a ventilation panel remained visible. 6 narrow slots had been covered, sanded, and painted over. Why would someone seal the air vents on discarded electronics? Ethan asked. Barrett did not answer immediately. Weather protection. Inside a covered transport? Sergeant, you are searching for a problem because your dog is distracted. Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog's focus had not broken for a second. He is not distracted. He lost his handler. Barrett's voice stayed controlled, but the words landed colder than the steel. Animals carry habits. Sense trigger memories. You know that better than anyone. Ethan stood slowly. Leave Noah out of this. I am trying to help you understand what you are seeing. You do not know what I am seeing. Ranger turned from the crate and stepped toward Ethan. His nose touched the front of Ethan's uniform, directly over the 2 identification tags hidden beneath the fabric. He breathed in once, then looked back at crate 117. The movement was small, deliberate. Ethan felt the damaged edge of Noah Bennett's tag against his skin. Barrett noticed where the dog had touched him. For the first time that evening, his calm expression shifted. It lasted less than a second, a faint tightening around the eyes. But Ethan saw it. "What is under your shirt?" Barrett asked. Ethan's hand remained at his side. "My tags. Both of them." The question came too quickly. Ethan looked at him. "Why does that matter?" Barrett glanced toward the loading crew. "It does not." But something had changed. His attention was no longer on Ranger. It was on Ethan's chest. A logistics clerk approached carrying a tablet. "Major, the Norfolk receiving office says they do not have this shipment on their arrival schedule." Barrett took the tablet without looking at Ethan. "Their system has not updated. They also said their night gate closes at midnight. Then the truck will hold off base until morning." Ethan studied the route sheet again. This transfer was marked urgent. Barrett handed the tablet back to the clerk. "Administrative errors happen. Several at once?" Ethan asked. Barrett's face became unreadable. "Complete your assignment." Ranger returned to the painted ventilation panel and pressed his nose against it. A faint sound escaped him, not a bark, not a growl, but a low breath that seemed almost like recognition. Ethan placed his fingertips on the fresh paint. It was dry, yet still smoother than the surrounding surface. He leaned closer and caught a scent beneath the machine oil and steel. Antiseptic. Damp cloth. Something warmer, almost human, gone before he could be certain. "I want thermal equipment brought in," Ethan said. Barrett turned sharply. "No," the single word cut through the warehouse. The clerk looked up. So did the forklift operator. Barrett lowered his voice. "There is no authorization to delay this cargo." "Then authorize it. You are done here." Ethan held his gaze. Ranger is not. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Barrett stepped away, pulled a phone from his coat, and walked toward the far end of the aisle. He spoke quietly, nearly hidden beneath the rain and the hum of fluorescent lights. Ethan could not hear the first sentence. He heard the second. "Move it tonight." Barrett paused, listening. His eyes returned to crate 117. "Before anyone else starts asking questions." He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. When he turned back, Ranger was watching him. Major Barrett walked back toward them with his expression restored, calm and smooth, as though the phone call had meant nothing. "The truck will be here within the hour," he said. "You have 10 minutes to complete the inspection." Ethan did not answer. His attention remained on the sealed ventilation panel and the thin line of fresh paint around its edges. Ranger stood beside him, watching the crate with a stillness that felt heavier than any trained alert. Ethan looked toward the equipment station near the loading bay. "Bring me the inspection camera," he told the logistics clerk. Barrett's eyes hardened. "That is unnecessary. Then it will confirm you are right." The clerk hesitated, caught between rank and procedure. Barrett said nothing. After a long moment, the young Marine crossed the warehouse and returned with a flexible camera line, a small screen, and a narrow inspection probe. Ethan knelt beside the crate and studied the covered ventilation panel. One slot near the bottom had not been completely filled. It was barely wide enough for the camera tip. He worked slowly, careful not to damage the seal, while Ranger hovered near his shoulder. The screen flickered from gray static into a dim green image. At first, there was only darkness and the blurred edge of steel. Ethan adjusted the angle. The camera slipped farther inside. A stack of folded blankets appeared. Beneath them sat two portable medical monitors, their screens dark, their cables tied neatly around the handles. There were canvas straps, sealed boxes of tubing, and a row of plastic containers marked for field hospital use. Everything matched the manifest. Ethan moved the camera from one side to the other. No face, no hand, no movement, no hidden passenger waiting in the dark. Just old equipment packed tightly inside a cold steel crate. Barrett stood over him. Satisfied? Ethan kept searching. The image showed the rear wall, the upper braces, and a heavy tarp folded over something rectangular. He angled the probe beneath it. More medical supplies. Nothing alive. Nothing that explained Ranger's behavior. The screen brightened when the camera light struck a polished metal surface, then dimmed again. Ethan withdrew the probe. For the first time that night, doubt entered him. It came quietly, without shame, and settled behind his ribs. Barrett might have been right. Ranger had lost Noah. The number 117, the scent of old medical fabric, the enclosed steel walls, Any one of them could have awakened a memory the dog did not understand. Loyalty could guide a creature home, but grief could also lead it into empty rooms. Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog met his gaze, waiting. "There is nobody in there," Ethan said softly. Ranger's ears remained forward. "You hear me? It is equipment." Barrett stepped back. "Remove him and finish your report." Ethan clipped the lead onto Ranger's collar. "Come." This time the dog rose, though slowly. Ethan guided him toward the end of the aisle. Ranger looked back once. Then again. His paws moved, but every part of him seemed to remain beside the crate. Ethan felt the pull of old guilt inside his chest. He had promised Noah the dog would never feel abandoned. Maybe he had mistaken that promise for a duty to believe every silence, every glance, every strange turn of the head. A good handler trusted his canine. A responsible Marine also knew when trust was becoming hope in disguise. They reached the loading bay, where rain blew in beneath the raised door and gathered in silver lines across the concrete. Ethan stopped beside a support column and loosened his grip on the lead. "I am sorry, buddy," he whispered. Ranger stood beside him, looking into the warehouse. Ethan turned to sign the inspection sheet resting on a nearby cart. The instant his attention shifted, the lead slid through his wet glove. Ranger moved. Not wildly, not with panic. He turned and ran between the rows of cargo with silent purpose. "Ranger." Ethan followed, boots striking the concrete as the dog disappeared into the third aisle. By the time Ethan reached crate 117, Ranger was no longer focused on the door, the lock, or the covered air vent. He had lowered himself beside the pallet and pushed his nose into the narrow space beneath the crate. Then he began to scratch at the floor. Slow at first. One paw, then the other. His claws scraped against concrete and caught on a thin metal edge hidden behind the pallet support. Ethan dropped to one knee. The crate's base should have rested flat on a single reinforced frame. Instead, a second steel plate sat several inches above the true bottom, creating a concealed space beneath the visible cargo. A false floor. Ethan pressed his hand against the lower panel. The metal was warmer there. He held his breath. At first, he heard only rain and the distant hum of the warehouse lights. Then, from behind the hidden plate, came a faint sound. Not a knock, not machinery, a breath. Weak, uneven, and unmistakably human. Ethan kept his palm against the lower steel panel, afraid that even the smallest movement might erase the sound he had just heard. For several seconds, nothing came. Then the faint breath returned, shallow and uneven, hidden beneath the packed equipment and the weight of the false floor. Ranger pressed closer, his nose fixed to the seam, his entire body quiet except for the slow rise of his chest. "There is someone in there," Ethan said. Major Barrett approached from the far end of the aisle, his steps measured, his face unreadable beneath the fluorescent lights. "What did you say?" Ethan did not look away from the crate. "The bottom has been altered. There is a concealed compartment, and I heard breathing." Barrett crouched beside him, but did not touch the steel. "You heard air moving through a damaged vent. The vents were sealed. Then pressure is shifting inside the container." Ethan turned toward him. "Metal does not breathe." The words settled between them. Nearby, the logistics clerk had stopped writing. The forklift operator stood beside his machine with both hands at his sides. Ranger lowered his head and released a single soft whine, the first sound anyone had heard from him all evening. Barrett glanced at the dog, then at the men watching from the loading bay. "Clear the aisle," he ordered. Everyone returned to assigned positions. No one moved at first. Barrett's voice became firmer. "Now." The crew slowly withdrew, though several looked back over their shoulders. Ethan remained beside the crate. "Call medical personnel and base. Security. There is no evidence of a person inside." "I heard one." "You heard what you wanted to hear." Ethan stood. "Then let someone else confirm it." Barrett's expression cooled. "You are emotionally compromised, Sergeant. This crate carries a number connected to your deceased friend, and your dog is reacting to old scents. That is not evidence." Ethan felt Noah's damaged identification tag against his chest. "The false floor is evidence." Barrett reached for his phone. "I will request a second inspection in the morning. The shipment leaves tonight. Plans change. You said the truck was coming within the hour." For the first time, Barrett did not have an immediate answer. Ranger began moving along the crate again, his nose tracing the lower edge. He stopped near the center and sat. Not the alert for explosives. Not the signal for narcotics. A simple sit, the way Noah had once taught him to wait beside someone who could not move. Ethan remembered seeing it during training years earlier. Ranger would find a hidden Marine, sit near the person, and remain there until help arrived. He would not bark. He would not leave. He found someone, Ethan said. Barrett's eyes flickered toward the loading bay door. You are done with this inspection. No. The word came quietly, but it carried farther than Ethan expected. Before Barrett could respond, headlights swept across the high windows. A dark government vehicle stopped outside, and moments later Special Agent Claire Morgan entered the warehouse, rain shining on the shoulders of her navy coat. She was in her early 40s, with light brown hair pulled back neatly and an expression that missed very little. I received a report of a documentation discrepancy, she said. Barrett looked toward the clerk, who immediately lowered his gaze. A routine accounting issue, Barrett replied. Claire walked to the crate and examined the manifest. A 300-pound discrepancy is not routine. Ethan pointed toward the lower panel. There is a concealed compartment. Claire crouched and placed 2 fingers against the seam. Ranger watched her, but did not move. She listened. The warehouse became still again. Nothing. No breath. No movement. Only the rain. Claire stood slowly. We need thermal imaging and an authorized opening team. Barrett stepped closer. This cargo is restricted. So is transporting an undocumented human being. There is no human being. As if the warehouse itself had been waiting for the words, the lights overhead flickered once. Then twice. The hum of electricity dropped away, and darkness swallowed the aisles. A few emergency lamps glowed red along the walls, too dim to reach the center of the building. Rain thundered across the roof. Somewhere near the rear bay, a generator tried to start and failed. Ethan reached for Ranger's collar, finding the familiar leather in the dark. Easy, he whispered. The dog was already still. No panic. No confusion. His head was raised toward the crate. Claire activated a small flashlight, its beam cutting across the steel and catching Barrett's face for half a second. He looked toward the loading door. We are moving the shipment before the storm gets worse. Ethan stepped between him and the crate. Nothing moves. Barrett's voice hardened. That is an order. Then the sound came. 3 faint knocks from beneath the false floor. Tap, tap, tap. Silence followed. Ethan felt every memory inside him rise at once. Afghanistan. A collapsed training structure. Dust in the air. Noah trapped behind a damaged wall, using the signal their team had practiced when radios failed. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks again. Ranger leaned forward, ears high. The second pattern came from inside the crate. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 heartbeat. Claire looked at him. You know that signal. Ethan opened his eyes and stared at the steel. Yes, he said. And so does my dog. The 3 knocks faded into the darkness, but Ethan heard them long after the sound was gone. They carried the weight of memory, of dust-filled rooms and broken radios, of one voice calling through a wall when no one else could hear. Ranger stood beside him with his ears raised, his body angled toward the crate, not trembling, not uncertain. He knew. Ethan could see it in the stillness of the dog's face. Special Agent Claire Morgan kept her flashlight fixed on the lower panel. We open it now, she said. Major Barrett stepped between her and the crate. You do not have authority to breach restricted cargo. Claire's gaze did not leave him. I have authority to prevent an unauthorized transfer, and this shipment is no longer routine. You heard loose metal. We heard a distress signal. Barrett turned toward Ethan. Sergeant Walker, remove the dog and return to the loading bay. Ethan stood slowly. The emergency lights cast long red shadows across the aisle. Rain struck the roof hard enough to blur every other sound. No, sir. Barrett's expression changed. Not anger. Something colder. That is a direct order. Then it is one I cannot follow. Ranger moved closer and placed 1 paw on Ethan's boot. The gesture was so gentle that it nearly broke him. The dog did not pull. He did not plead. He simply waited, the way he had waited beside Noah's empty door, the way he had waited through memorials, commands, and 8 months of silence. Ethan looked down at him and understood what the dog had been doing all along. Ranger was not trapped in grief. He was holding a position. He had never stopped searching because he had never accepted the absence as truth. Barrett stepped nearer. Think carefully. You are placing your career at risk over an animal's reaction and a sound you cannot prove. Ethan reached to the front of his uniform and removed the small insignia fastened near his collar. He set it on the edge of a nearby cargo cart. The metal clicked softly against the surface. Then record that I made the choice. Barrett stared at the insignia. Do not do this. Ethan looked at the crate. Someone inside already did. Claire lowered her voice. The emergency cutting tools are in the maintenance station. Ethan nodded. I know. Barrett moved to block the aisle. Nobody touches that lock. Ranger stepped forward and stood between Ethan and Barrett, not aggressive, not growling, only present. His posture said enough. Ethan rested one hand on the dog's back. Stay. Ranger obeyed, though his eyes remained on the crate. Claire crossed toward the maintenance cabinet while Ethan went to the wall phone and tried to reach medical support. The line was dead. The storm had taken the building network with the power. Use your radio, Claire said. Ethan called for emergency personnel and base security. Static answered first, then a faint confirmation from another building. Help was coming, but the rain had flooded part of the eastern access road. Barrett listened, his comm beginning to fray around the edges. You are creating a scene over nothing. Ethan returned with a heavy bolt cutter and a portable steel pry tool. Then nothing will be harmed by being seen. He positioned the jaws around the lock. Barrett reached for the handle, but Claire stepped between them. Major, stand back. This is military property, and now it is evidence. The warehouse seemed to hold its breath. Ethan tightened his grip. The lock was thicker than it appeared, cold and slick beneath his gloves. He pressed down. Metal groaned, but did not give. Ranger's gaze followed every movement. Ethan adjusted the angle and tried again. His shoulders strained beneath the wet fabric of his uniform. The lock shifted a fraction. From inside the crate came a faint scrape, followed by a single soft knock. Ranger's ears rose higher. He knows we are here, Ethan said. Barrett turned toward the loading bay, where headlights appeared through the rain. The transport truck had arrived early. Its engine idled beyond the open door, sending a low vibration through the floor. Barrett looked at the driver and raised one hand, signaling him forward. No, Claire said. The truck continued toward the marked loading position. Ranger broke from his stay and ran into the open lane. He stopped directly in front of the vehicle, forcing the driver to brake. Tires hissed on wet concrete. The German shepherd lowered himself across the path and refused to move. Ethan looked from Ranger to the crate, then back to Barrett. The pieces aligned with sudden clarity. The urgency, the sealed vents, the missing schedule, the false floor, the truck arriving before authorization. You were never planning to send this to Norfolk, Ethan said. Barrett's face went still. Ethan placed the cutter against the lock once more. You were planning to make it disappear. He pushed down with everything he had left. The lock snapped open and fell to the concrete. The sound rang through the warehouse like a bell. Ranger rose from the truck lane and ran back to Ethan's side. Together, they faced the sealed door as Claire lifted the latch. For one suspended moment, no one moved. Then Ethan pulled the door open, and a breath of cold, stale air reached them from the darkness inside. Cold air rolled from the crate and carried the faint scent of antiseptic, damp canvas, and something human beneath it. Ethan lifted Claire's flashlight and aimed the beam into the darkness. Rows of medical monitors lined the walls, their screens blank, their cords wrapped in careful loops. Sealed containers sat beneath folded blankets. Metal cases had been strapped tightly to the floor. For 1 second, the scene looked exactly like the manifest promised. Nothing moved. Nothing answered. Major Barrett let out a slow breath behind them. You see, he said. Equipment. Ethan did not respond. Ranger stepped inside. His paws landed lightly on the steel floor, each movement deliberate. He passed the monitors, the cartons, the canvas straps. His nose moved close to the ground. Then he stopped near the center of the crate and lowered his head over a narrow groove hidden beneath a folded tarp. Ethan climbed in after him. The air felt warmer there. Ranger caught one edge of the tarp between his teeth and pulled. Beneath it lay a rectangular steel panel set flush with the floor. No handle, no label. Only 4 bolts and a seam thin enough to miss in poor light. Claire knelt beside Ethan. That is not part of the cargo design. Barrett remained outside the crate. Do not touch it. Ethan looked back at him. Why? Barrett's face stayed still. Because you do not know what is beneath it. Claire raised her flashlight. That sounds like you do. Barrett said nothing. Ranger placed both front paws on the hidden panel. His nose found a narrow gap near the far corner. A weak breath touched the fur along his muzzle. The dog froze. Then his tail moved once. Not with excitement. With recognition. Ethan felt the world narrow to that single motion. He gripped the pry tool and worked its edge into the seam. The metal resisted. Claire braced the flashlight while Ethan pressed down. One bolt shifted with a dry click. Another followed. The panel lifted less than an inch, and warmer air escaped from below. Ranger pushed his nose toward the opening and released a sound Ethan had not heard in 8 months. A soft, broken bark. It was not loud enough to carry beyond the crate, but it struck Ethan harder than any alarm. "Ranger," he whispered. The dog looked at him, then back at the floor. Ethan pulled again. The panel rose several inches. Claire reached in and helped guide it aside. Beneath was a compartment no more than 3 feet high, lined with blankets and dimly lit by the flashlight. A man lay curled on his side beneath a gray field coat. His face was pale and thin, his hair longer than Ethan remembered, his breathing shallow but steady. A strip of medical tape crossed one wrist where an intravenous line had once been placed, but there was no fresh injury, only exhaustion and time written across every feature. Ethan stared without moving. The years of service, the memorial, the folded flag, the empty grave, all of it seemed to lose its meaning in a single breath. "Noah," he said. The name barely left his mouth. Ranger did not rush forward. He stood at the edge of the opening, trembling now, as though hope itself had become too large to trust. The man's eyelids moved. Slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. They wandered across the beam of light, found Ethan, then shifted toward the dog. His lips parted. No sound came at first. Ranger leaned closer, ears high, waiting for the one voice he had carried in memory. Noah swallowed and whispered, "Ranger, home." The German shepherd lowered himself into the compartment and pressed his forehead against Noah's chest. His whole body softened at once. The silence he had carried for 8 months broke into a low, aching whine. Noah lifted one weak hand and rested it between the dog's ears. Ethan turned away for half a second, not because he wanted to hide what he felt, but because some moments are too sacred to watch directly. Claire called for medical personnel over her radio. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes stayed fixed on Noah. Outside the crate, Barrett stepped backward. The transport truck engine changed pitch near the loading bay. Ethan heard the sound and looked up. Barrett was already moving toward the aisle. "Stop," Claire said. Barrett paused but did not turn. Ethan climbed out of the crate and stood between him and the loading door. "You knew he was alive." Barrett's face hardened. "You do not understand what you found." "Then explain it." Behind Ethan, Noah shifted beneath the blankets. He reached inside his field coat and pulled free a second identification tag, blackened at one edge like the one Ethan wore. The tag opened along a hidden seam. Inside was a tiny storage device no larger than a thumbnail. Noah held it toward Claire with a trembling hand. "Records," he whispered. "Shipments. Names. Hospitals." Claire took the device carefully. Noah's eyes moved toward Barrett. He changed the manifests. Barrett looked toward the open loading bay, but base security vehicles had arrived beyond the ring. Blue lights reflected across the wet concrete and the steel walls of the warehouse. Claire stepped out of the crate and faced him. "Major Barrett, remain where you are." Barrett finally turned. The confidence had left his expression, replaced by the stillness of a man watching every locked door open at once. Ethan looked back at Noah and Ranger. The dog had curled beside his first handler, one paw resting across Noah's sleeve, as if 8 months had been nothing more than a long watch. Noah met Ethan's eyes and tried to smile. "Told you," he breathed. "He would find me." Ethan touched the damage tag beneath his shirt. Outside, the storm began to weaken. Inside the crate, Ranger refused to move, because the person the world had buried was breathing beneath his paw. By dawn, the storm had moved east over the Atlantic, leaving the base washed in pale gold and standing water. Medical vehicles had carried Noah Bennett to the Naval Hospital before sunrise, and Major Owen Barrett had been escorted from Warehouse 4 under the watch of base security. The transport truck remained where it had stopped, its tires dark against the wet concrete, its cargo doors still open to the gray morning. Special Agent Claire Morgan sealed the records room collected the altered manifests, and placed Noah's storage device into evidence. What had begun as a discrepancy in weight became a map of years of hidden shipments, rerouted supplies, false destinations, and medical equipment meant for veterans' hospitals that had never reached the people waiting for it. Barrett had trusted locked doors, official stamps, and the silence of men who feared losing their careers. He had not planned for a German shepherd who remembered one voice better than the system remembered the truth. Ethan sat outside Noah's hospital room later that afternoon, with Ranger lying beneath his chair. The hallway smelled of coffee, disinfectant, and rain carried in on uniforms. Nurses moved quietly past. Somewhere beyond the windows, tires rolled over wet pavement, and a helicopter crossed the low clouds toward the coast. Ethan had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Noah beneath the hidden floor, pale and breathing, and Ranger standing at the opening as though the last 8 months had folded into a single heartbeat. Claire came down the hall carrying 2 paper cups. She handed one to Ethan and sat beside him. "The doctors say he is stable," she said. "Dehydrated, weak, but stronger than anyone expected." Ethan looked through the narrow glass panel in the door. Noah slept beneath a white blanket, his face calmer now. He always hated being underestimated. Claire glanced at Ranger. So did his partner. Ranger lifted his head at the word partner, but did not rise. Claire told Ethan what they had learned. Noah had discovered irregularities shortly before the warehouse fire. He had copied shipping records and hidden them inside a modified identification tag. When he tried to report the evidence, the fire was used to make his disappearance look final. For months, he had been moved between secure locations while Barrett's network searched for the records. Noah never told them where the device was. They assumed it had been destroyed. They never imagined he had carried it against his heart. Ethan reached beneath his shirt and touched the damaged tag he had worn since the memorial. Claire noticed the gesture. "The one you have was planted at the fire scene," she said. "Close enough to be believed. Different enough to keep the real evidence hidden." Ethan stared at the floor. "I stood in front of his mother and told her he was gone." "You told her what everyone believed." Ranger did not believe it. Claire looked at the dog. Maybe he knew more than everyone. The hospital room door opened near sunset. A nurse smiled at Ethan. "He is awake." Ranger rose before Ethan did. Inside, Noah looked smaller than memory, but his eyes were clear. Late sunlight rested across the blanket and warmed the room with the soft amber color of home. Ethan stopped beside the bed, unsure whether to speak, laugh, apologize, or simply remain still. Noah saved him from choosing. "You look terrible," he said, his voice weak but dry with familiar humor. Ethan let out a breath that became almost a laugh. "You have looked better." Ranger stood between them, watching Noah's face. Noah lowered one hand over the edge of the bed. The dog stepped forward and placed his muzzle into it. For a while, no one spoke. Noah's fingers moved slowly through the sable fur near Ranger's scarred ear. Ethan watched the two of them and felt relief arrive without celebration, quiet and almost painful, like warmth returning to frozen hands. "I thought he would forget me," Noah whispered. Ethan shook his head. "He forgot how to bark before he forgot you." Noah's eyes closed for a moment. Ranger pressed closer. In the weeks that followed, the case widened. Arrests were made. Missing supplies were recovered. Hospitals received equipment that had been sitting in warehouses under false names. Noah began walking the rehabilitation halls a few steps at a time, always with Ranger matching his pace. Ethan remained nearby, but a question grew inside him. Ranger had belonged to Noah first. The reunion should have made the answer simple. Yet loyalty was rarely simple when it had saved more than one life. On the morning Noah was cleared to leave the hospital, Ethan stood near the entrance holding Ranger's leash. Noah waited beside a wheelchair, though he insisted on standing for the final few feet. "He is yours," Ethan said, offering the lead. Noah looked at Ranger, then at Ethan. "No," he said softly. "He found me because you trusted him." Ethan tried to answer, but Ranger made the decision before either man could. He walked to the space between them, placed one paw against Noah's boot, and leaned his back against Ethan's leg. Then he lay down. Noah smiled. Ethan looked away toward the bright parking lot, where the morning sun reflected from hundreds of small puddles. No one was being left behind. Several weeks later, Ethan returned to Warehouse 4 after the investigation team released the building. Crate 117 was gone. The floor had been cleaned. The manifests had been removed. Yet beside the place where the steel box had rested, 3 faint claw marks remained in the concrete. Ranger stopped and looked at them. Ethan touched Noah's tag beneath his shirt, then rested one hand on the dog's neck. Maybe it had been training. Maybe memory. Maybe a scent too small for any human to recognize. Or maybe grace sometimes waits behind steel, trusting that one faithful heart will hear it breathing.